These hearings initiate the new ICC code development process as outlined in the ICC Board Advisory in early February of this year. As noted in the advisory, there will be one cycle of code development between editions. The 2009-2010 cycle is a transition cycle in the new process, and as such, all codes will be considered at these 2009 code development hearings, leading to the 2012 editions of the code. Going forward in 2012, there will be 2 code development and final action hearings, with 1/2 the codes considered in each 12-month period. My name is John Terry, and I will be the moderator for the International Fire and Urban Wildland Interface Codes. As has been previously published, there are no hard copies of the monograph for distribution at these hearings as part of the ICC's Green Initiative. At this time, I would like to welcome our friends who could not be here but are taking advantage of the ICC's webcast via the internet. As in the past, both tracks 1 and 2 will be webcast. The hearing schedule, which identifies the 2 tracks, is published both in the posted code change book, page Roman numeral 20, and on the website. These hearings will be held in accordance with the ICC Council Policy 28, as published on page 12 of the posted code change book. As with all of our hearings, we kindly ask that conversations be kept to a minimum, and if need be, please taken outside of the room. The hearings will be conducted in accordance with Robert's Rules of Orders as revised by Council Policy 28 on page 12. Code development hearings are open meetings, and any interested person may participate in the floor discussion. Only committee members are permitted to vote on a committee action. All eligible voters are permitted to vote on the assembly action. This is identified on page Roman 2. Eligible voters are all ICC members. Committee members are also permitted to vote on an assembly motion. If you have not registered and received your badge and electronic voting device, please do so now. Either a purple, government and honorary members, or a brown, other ICC members, is needed to vote. Individuals with a green badge are for staff and non-members, and they are not permitted to vote on assembly actions. In order for the hearing attendees to monitor the status of code changes being heard in the other hearing room, the status of the hearings will be shown on the screens. The moderator has the authority to establish rules and time limits on debate in the interest of time and fairness to all hearing participants. Considering the number of proposals to be heard these 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, approximately 2,500 agenda items, floor discussion participants will be limited at the microphone in the discussion order. Floor discussion will proceed as follows. Proponents, 2 minutes per person. Opponents, 2 minutes per person. Rebuttal, 1 minute per person. Re-rebuttal, 1 minute per person. Please remember, the committee has reviewed these proposals and has read the reason statement. Additional information is suggested. Any participant in the hearing may suggest a floor modification to any proposal. The person proposing the modification will be considered the proponent of that modification. As noted on page Roman 7 of the posted code change book, a copyright release is required for all modifications. If you have executed a release for the 2009-2010 cycle, then you're all set. If not, copies of the copyright release are available at the staff table. 20 written copies of the proposed modification must be provided for the moderator, committee members, and staff, including a hard copy for overhead projection, well in advance of the code change being brought to the floor. Each modification must have the code change number, the proponent of the modification noted on the modification, and must be legible. It also must be a large enough type for overhead projection. As noted in section 5.5.2.2, The process for ruling by the chair has been revised such that the chair's ruling as to the modifications being ruled in and out of order is not subject to a point of order. As such, the chair's ruling is final. At the completion of the floor discussion on each proposal, the committee will make one of the following motions: approve the code change proposal as submitted, approve the code change proposal as modified with a specific modification, or disapprove the code change proposal. The discussion on the motion is limited to the Code Development Committee members only. Each motion will be voted on by the Code Development Committee with a majority dictating the committee's action. All committee votes are to be supported by a reason. At this time, we will go over the rules for assembly consideration. They are listed in Section 5.7 of the procedures and have been revised starting with this cycle. At the completion of a committee action, but before the next proposal is called to the floor, the moderator will ask if anyone in the assembly wishes to make a motion. Any attendee may raise an objection to the committee's action. An acceptable assembly motion is either to approve the proposal as submitted, approve the proposal as modified, or disapprove the proposal. An assembly action for as modified is permitted. Section 5.7.1, item number 2, limits the permitted modifications to those that have been discussed in the public hearing portion of the hearing. Section 5.7.3 outlines the required majorities for a successful assembly motion. In all cases, a 2/3 majority is required. As noted previously, all ICC members are permitted to vote on an assembly action. Committee members are also eligible to vote. One vote is authorized per eligible attendee. In accordance with Council Policy Number 28, additional testimony will not be permitted on assembly motions. Voting on assembly motions will first be conducted by a show of hands. If the results are not conclusive as determined by the moderator, we will utilize the electronic voting devices. The committee action, in addition to the assembly action, if brought forward and sustained, will be reported as the results of the public hearing. As noted in Section 7.3.8.2, a successful assembly action will be the initial motion on the code change at the final action hearings. All eligible ICC members are issued an electronic voting device. You also should have received a notice when you picked up that device. This notice reads, "Notice to eligible voters for code development hearings. You are receiving this voting device because you have registered as one of the following: a governmental voting representative, specifically designated by a governmental member as one of the representatives voting on behalf of that jurisdiction in accordance with the ICC bylaws. A corporate voting representative, which is limited to one vote per corporate member. The corporation's designee is on file with the ICC and cannot be substituted unless designated by the official corporate point of contact by the deadline established by ICC Council policy. A building safety professional member, purchased either by an individual or by an organization on behalf of the individual and as listed on file with the ICC. Other member categories as established by the ICC and contained in the ICC files. Or a code committee member who, regardless of membership status, has their committee items under discussion. Your eligibility is conditioned on the following assumptions. Per Council Policy 36 regarding sponsorship and contributions, no governmental voting representative has accepted funds to finance their attendance at these hearings from organizations other than their employer or their unit of government, the ICC, or an ICC chapter. The use of the voting device is restricted to the badge holders who are ICC members as of the posted date of October 14, 2009, in accordance with Section 5.7.4 of Council Policy Number 28. Your membership dues relevant to your voting statuses are current. Your voting privileges will be revoked by ICC staff determines that your participation is not in compliance with the above policies and procedures. At this time, we would like to test the voting devices. For those of you in track 1, a yes vote, you push 1. A no vote, you push 2. We have a I know Brian didn't read that faster than I did. All right, there's your voting device. Do we have a sample question? You've been prompted. Ooh. I'll tell you what button to push, okay? I got you covered. Trust me. You guys can't see the screen, right? All right. Question's not up yet. For the sake of the committee, I'll read you the question, all right? There it is. I'll tell you how to vote. Who will the Phillies play in the World Series? 1, for the Yankees. 2, for the Angels. The Phillies, the world champions.
Twas just a garden in the rain.
Consensus says 57% the Yankees will lose to the Phillies in the World Series. Thank you. Did anyone have a problem with their voting device? If you have a problem with your voting device, please take it to the staff at the table outside of the hearing room. Thank you. No code change proposal will be reconsidered after it has been voted on by the committee or the assembly. Me Too testimony is not permitted. The chair of the committee, through the moderator, may end public testimony when nothing new is being offered. Scheduled breaks each day will vary. They will be announced. One second, Rick. Let me get through this.
It's on this voting thing.
What's that? Excuse me?
Question on the voting.
Okay, go ahead.
I see it showed a percentage, but do we get a hard number also that we can see?
Help me out, staff.
An actual vote count?
Right, absolutely.
I trust the computer program, however.
I agree. I agree. You got that? All right. Yes, thank you. Staff has assured me that there will be an actual vote count as well as the percentage. You're welcome. At this time, let's discuss the errata. The known errata has previously been posted on the ICC website, and copies are in the back of the room. I understand staff has some unpublished errata. You have unpublished errata? Yeah, you said there was unpublished errata?
Mr. Moderator, we have one unpublished errata that will be to IWUIC 5.
All right, we have that on the screen?
You want it now or when it comes up?
All right. What will happen is when WUIC 5 is called, I will ask that the unpublished errata be posted on the screen. Anything else? Okay, thank you. Agenda changes. The agenda order is published in the posted proposed code change book. Thank you very much. Code change proposals are paced in a logical order to expedite this hearing. Any individual may move a revised agenda order as the first order of business or at any time during the hearing except while another proposal is being heard. Preference will be given to grouping like subjects and moving items back to a later position. A revision to the agenda requires a 2/3 vote of those present and voting. Staff has identified and posted on the ICC website changes to the hearing agenda. They are comprehensively listed in the errata package. Because the WUIC and the International Fire Code is one hearing, at this time, I will call for agenda changes to both the WUIC and the Fire Code. Are there any adjustments to the agenda? Any changes to the agenda? Please.
Pat McLaughlin, McLaughlin Associates, representing the Compressed Gas Association, request that items F-174, F-176, and F-177 be moved after F-215. Those are all in the same subject matter,
All right.
all dependent on each other.
174, 176, and 177?
Correct.
get
After
there.
F-215. And I've got the agreement of the proponents, the Hydrogen Industry Panel on Codes and the National Association of State Fire Marshal for that move.
So we have F-174, 176, and 177 to be heard immediately following F-215. Are there any objections from the House? So moved. Next. Come on, folks.
Good morning. I'm Tom Hammerberg with the Automatic Fire Alarm Association, and I'd like to withdraw F-130.
I'm going to get to withdrawals, but withdrawals are always
Okay.
in order.
Thank you.
F-130 has been withdrawn. Are you the proponent, sir? F-130 has been withdrawn by the proponent. Yes.
Glenn Dean,
Good morning, Glenn.
F-186, like to move it behind 195, just before 196.
You'd like to move F-186 to immediately follow
195.
197,
195.
195. 186 to follow 195? Okay. Are there any objections from the House? 186 to immediately follow 195. Mr. Thornberry.
Thank you. Rick Thornberry with the Code Consortium, representing the American Pyrotechnics Association. With that action, we'd like to see F-186 and the following items, F-196 through F-199, held until the first order of business on Monday morning. I've got a problem with somebody that's coming in to testify, and they won't be able to make it. It may come up Sunday night, so.
All right.
Yeah.
I can't guarantee you that it's going to be the first item of business on Monday morning.
If it comes before.
If we have not proceeded to that point, then it will be held in order.
I understand.
However, if they will definitely be held until beginning of Monday morning.
That would be our request. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Any objections from the House? Seeing none. F-196, 197, 198, and 190. Did I go too far? 196, 197.
F-186, because you just moved F-186 to before F-196, so it's grouping with that.
Okay, so you want
Yeah.
186,
Correct.
196, 197, 198, and 199, all to be heard as the first item of business on Monday morning. In that order. Fantastic. Any objections from the House? So moved. Mr. Davidson.
Robert Davidson, Ancient Order Code Scallywags, and I'd like to request that F-19 be heard after F-20.
F-19 to be heard after F-20. Part 1 and Part 2 on F-20?
Yes.
Any objections from the House? F19 will follow looks like F20 and F40 are being heard together. They're like subjects, doesn't matter. You want it after F40? Or after F20 Part 2? After F20 Part 2. Okay, F19 will be heard after F20 Part 2. So moved. Yes, sir.
Pat McLaughlin, I was called the other day by George Verbrick and asked to make a request that F10 and F14 be moved to after lunch on Sunday. First items after lunch on Sunday. They're not able to get here until then, and they wanted to testify.
F10
and F14.
Are there any objections from the House?
Yes, I object. I'm the author of that particular proposal, and I'm prepared to talk to it today in its scheduled time, so that's when I'd like to see it in the schedule.
Okay. An agenda item change requires a 2/3 majority from the House. At this time, all those in favor of moving F10 and F40 to after lunch on Monday, 14, thank you, keep me honest, F10 and F14 to after lunch on Monday, please raise your hand. And those opposed? Clearly did not carry. The agenda item is not changed. Any further changes to the agenda? Seeing no one at the mics. A code change proposal may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time prior to final action consideration of that proposal. Staff, any known withdrawals? Got any withdrawals for me, guys? You already did. F1, that was the only one you knew of? Okay, fantastic. Any other withdrawals? The only withdrawal that we have was F130. No other withdrawals. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to the chair to announce his committee. Marshall.
Mr. Moderator, my F, I think it was 73. There's an unpublished errata you might want to mention at this point.
You have an unpublished errata as well? What's the item number, Marshall, please?
I think it's F73. Staff has that.
Staff has it? You have another unpublished errata? Marshall, what will happen is when that code change is called, we will ask staff to put the unpublished errata up on the screens. You're welcome. At this time, we're going to turn the floor over to the chairman. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the public hearing conducted by the International Fire Code Development Committee on proposed code change proposals for the International Wildland Urban Interface Code and the International Fire Code. My name is John Muller. I'm with the New York State Office of Fire Prevention and Control, where I serve as the Deputy State Fire Administrator. I represent the National Association of State Fire Marshals on the Fire Code Development Committee, and I'm also a member of the Hydrogen Industry Panel on Codes. The ICC has assembled an exemplary group of people to serve on the Fire Code Development Committee, and I'd like to start out by having each of the committee members introduce themselves to you, starting at the far end.
Good morning. My name is Larry Christie. I'm the Fire Marshal for Butler Township, Butler, Pennsylvania.
Good morning. My name is Roland Crawford, Crawford Specialty Group, formerly Fire Marshal, Fire Chief for the City of Loma Linda Fire Department, Loma Linda, California. Retired.
Angie WUIC, Department of Safety and Inspections Fire Protection Engineer in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Good morning, Tanya Hoover, Acting State Fire Marshal, State of California.
Gib Watt, Fire Marshal's Office, City of San Marcos, Texas.
Sean DeCrane, Battalion Chief with the City of Cleveland Fire Department, representing Cleveland Fire Department and also the International Association of Firefighters. And for disclosure purposes, I also do work for the International Fire Stop Council and recuse myself of those proposals.
Richard Soltis, Fire Subcode Official, Lawrence Township, New Jersey.
Mike Love, Fire Marshal, Montgomery County, Maryland, representing International Association of Fire Chiefs.
Joe McElveny, City of Phoenix Fire Department, Lead Fire Protection Engineer.
Peter Merrill, Construction Dispute Resolution Services, former Fire Chief and Fire Marshal from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I represent the National Association of Home Builders.
Mark Wassum with the State of Colorado Division of Fire Safety, Fire Protection Engineer. I also represent the National Association of State Fire Marshals.
Rob Geisinger, I'm the Fire Marshal with the South Metro Fire Rescue Authority in Colorado and the Vice Chair.
Dave Bowman, ICC staff.
Bill Rare, ICC staff.
Thank you very much, committee members. Let the record reflect that a quorum is established of the Fire Code Development Committee. With that, is committee all set? Mr. Moderator, please call the first code change to the floor.
Let the games begin. We call to the floor UWIC 1. Testimony and support, UWIC 1.
Steve Orlowski, speaking on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. As indicated in our supporting reason, NAHB is attempting to clarify the proposal requirements for signage to be clearly identified by establishing minimum lettering height on a contrasting background with a minimum signage dimension, as well as establishing a clear understanding of what the height of the signage has to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony and support, UWIC 1. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one at the mics, Mr. Chair, UWIC 1 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion disapprove.
Thank you, Mr. Geislinger. Is there a second?
Second.
Who? Marshal Christie, were you the second?
Is the mic working? Yes.
Chief Gerslinger, back to you.
I don't think the language as written supports what the intent of the home builders wanted to do there. He talked about the intent to not establish a set 7-foot height. This actually doesn't do that. It says it shall be mounted at 7 feet.
Any other committee members have anything to say? Hearing no further discussion, I'll call the question. Motion and second for disapproval of WUIC 1. All those in favor, please raise your hands. All those opposed? The motion carries 10-1. Mr. Moderator, WUIC 1 has been disapproved.
WUIC 1 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor WUIC 2, testimony and support.
Marcelo Hirscher, GBH International, American Fire Safety Council, proponent of WUIC 2. Throughout the ICC codes, we have requirements for fire resistance rated construction and fire resistance ratings, and talk about 1 hour walls and 1 hour different things. That's the same as valid in the the Wildland Urban Interface Code. However, in the Wildland Code, there is no reference to the actual test that you shall use for that. And the test that we use throughout the ICC codes is the ASTM E119 or UL 263. That's all this does, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Further testimony in support of WUIC 1, WUIC 2. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, WUIC 2 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Make a motion to approve it, accept it, as submitted.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Soltis. Mr. McElvaney.
Based on the reasons submitted this does provide the information that we need.
Okay, Chief Crawford.
I believe this is a logical addition to the code because there are references made to this, and it's reasonable to have the standards referenced.
Any other committee members wish to speak? Hearing no further discussion, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second to approve as submitted WUIC 2. All those in favor, please raise your hands. All those opposed, please raise your hand. The motion carries. Mr. Moderator, motion for as submitted for WUIC 2 has been approved.
Item WUIC 2 has been approved as submitted. Is there a motion from the floor? Seeing none, we call to the floor. Item WUIC 3, testimony and
Mr.
support.
Chairman, I'm going to recuse myself for this proposal as Ruxell is a member of the Fire Staff Council.
Okay.
Thank you. We call to the floor. WUIC 3, testimony and support.
Rocky Boyer with Roxell Installation, speaking for John Scott. The purpose of this proposal is to introduce a new type of ignition-resistant building material into the IWUIC based upon testing in conformance with the newest edition of FM 4470 approval standard for single-ply modified bitumen built-up roof and liquid-applied roof assemblies. The 2009 edition of FM approval standard 4470 has introduced a new category of roofing insulation defined as Class NC non-combustible core. For a roof insulation material to be classified NC, the roof insulation must meet the following stringent criteria. ASTM D482 standard test method for ash from petroleum products. ASTM E2058 standard test methods for measurement of synthetic polymer material flammability using a fire propagation apparatus. ISO 1716-2002 reaction to fire test for building products determination of heat combustion. These very stringent criteria include a minimum total solids content of 90% per ASTM D482. ASTM E2058 test shows no visible flaming in test and continued until mass loss and visible vapors have also ceased. The ISO 1716, which is used for determination of heat combustion of building materials, the insulation core must have a maximum heat combustion of 2 kilojoules per gram and 860 BTU per pound, and typical mineral wool roofing products have a flame spread and smoke development ratings not exceeding 25 and 50. Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
We have a question for the proponent.
Does the FM standard define what a core is?
Offhand, I do not know, but I can find that out for you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, further testimony in support. WUIC 3. In support? Testimony in opposition.
Jess Beidel, Hughes Associates, representing XPSA on this particular issue. The problem we have with this roof insulation, or the additional words, is that it basically eliminates many of the roof insulations that are currently used in the United States at this point. Foam plastic type insulations are used. They meet the requirements of, for Class A ratings, can also meet the requirements of 4470, but they are not non-combustible materials. By specifying this, you will eliminate an entire class of roof insulation materials without any specific reason or any past poor performance identified by those materials. So we request this be denied. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. WUIC 3.
Good morning. Marcelo Hirscher, GBH International, speaker of the American Fire Safety Council. The gentleman who spoke in favor of the proposal referenced that there are 2 fire tests contained within that FM standard. ASTM E2058, which is the FM fire propagation apparatus, and ISO 1716, which is a bomb calorimeter. Neither of those is a test for non-combustibility. You cannot declare a material non-combustible unless you run a test that really assesses whether it's combustible or non-combustible. Neither one of those tests is a test for non-combustibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. WUIC 3.
Lorraine Ross, Intech Consulting, representing the polyiso insulation manufacturers, and CPI, the Center for the Polyurethanes Industry. We're opposed to this for 4 reasons. One, although FM 4470 is currently in the IBC, FM 4470-09 has not been cleared as far as compliance with the ICC standards analysis. If you look at page 10 of the standards analysis, you'll see that. Secondly, it selectively removes a component of a roof assembly. So all of these roof assemblies are tested as components within the tests that are listed in FM 4470. Number three, if adopted, as just mentioned, it'll remove thousands, literally thousands of roof assemblies from that particular market. And while the proponent claims that there's no increase in cost of this code change, there will be a cost increase because of the removal of choices. So for all of these reasons, we'd like to ask you to please disapprove this modification. Thanks. This proposal.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. Rebuttal in support. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, WUIC 3 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion to oppose.
Second.
Or disapprove.
Motion by Chief Hoover for disapproval. There's a second by Chief Watt. Chief Hoover.
I don't have loss history on insulation. I have a problem having something placed in the code, a new standard developed, isolating product when we don't have loss data that insulation contributes to large fire loss.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for disapproval of WUIC 3. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. All those opposed? Motion for disapproval carries. Mr. Moderator, the motion for disapproval of WUIC 3 has passed.
Item WUIC 3 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing no one at the mics, WUIC 4 to the floor. Testimony in support. WUIC 4.
Good morning, John Weistman with the Composite Lumber Manufacturers Association, recommending approval of WUIC 4. What I've attempted to do here is based on feedback from our composite lumber manufacturers as far as trying to interpret, understand, and apply the current section 503.2 of the Wildland Urban Interface Code. So it's an editorial rewrite to rearrange things so it's easier to understand, clear to understand. It's technically very similar to what was put in there and approved in the last round. We've also added for wood plastic composites the option to test products to the ASTM E1354 test. UL is testing products for the California Wildland Urban Interface requirements based on the California's 12-7A4 test. And that test works well. There's a lot of products being tested for it. Unfortunately, that standard may not be considered a consensus standard for the IBC, so we can't reference, or likely can't reference that. We commissioned, CLMA commissioned with UL testing evaluation of ASTM E1354 compared to the underdeck flame test there of 12-7A4 of California, and found essentially a one-to-one correlation. So using UL's experience, we're recommending an alternative to that testing of ASTM E1354. Also, was pointed out this week earlier on some discussion that we missed including a maximum or well, let me do this. Let me move to modification number 2 that staff has.
Okay. We have. Are you recommending that modification?
Yes, sir. Moving modification number 2 that I provided.
I need a ruling on that, Mr. Chair. You have the modification?
Yes, I do.
Okay. We need to get a ruling on that modification before it's discussed.
That modification is in order.
Okay. Chair has ruled modification in order. At this time, testimony in support of the modification. We're going to discuss the modification and deal with that first. Okay? Right. In support of the modification, you have 2 minutes.
John Weistman, Composite Lumber Manufacturers Association. It was pointed out earlier this week that the ASTM E1354 test needs to have a minimum initial radiant heat flux specified for the testing. And that's what this modification does. This recommendation is consistent with the UL testing practices they have with composite decking materials for the California 12-7A4 and the E1354 testing.
Thank you.
Question.
Question?
Does the ASTM standard E1354 have a lower minimum radiating heat flux test, like can you use 25 instead? Is that why you're putting the minimum 35 in there?
As I understand, E1354 doesn't specify a radiant heat flux at all. It's silent on that, and it varies by the product tested. That's my understanding. And this is a test. This is a value consistent with UL testing.
So is there some scientific data that you can demonstrate to me where you chose the 35 versus 45 or 55?
I don't have that. I apologize. I don't have that.
Thank you. Further testimony in support of the modification. We're speaking only to the modification now, folks. Testimony in opposition to the modification.
Marcelo Hirscher, GBH International for the American Fire Safety Council. Joe, let's start by answering your question. In ASTM E1354, known as the cone calorimeter, you can test it any heat flux from 0 to 100 kilowatts per square meter. And that was one of the key problems with the proposal. There are many more problems. But so this improves because at least it gives you something. It still doesn't tell you what the orientation is, doesn't tell you what the thickness is. And second, with regard to the heat flux involved, 35 kilowatts per square meter is very, very small. Is what you would consider for something like interior finish, wall coverings, if you want to predict what happens in a wall covering in a room. So I object to this. Sorry, I recommend disapproval. I'm going to talk about the rest of the proposal later. Thank you.
That's fine.
Question.
Question for the speaker.
Sorry.
You have a question? Frank?
Frank, yeah.
Would anybody have a suggestion as to what would be an appropriate heat flux for this type of exposure?
My opinion would be something like 75 kilowatts per square meter, and the pass-fail criteria needs to be lower than what is in there. But I'll talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none. We are in opposition to the modification. Speaking only to the modification. Jeff?
Jess Beidel, Hughes Associates. Speaking for myself on this issue, I have the same problem where Solo just spoke about 35. If I had to answer Mr. Calavecchia's question, I suppose, open flame hitting these samples would typically be around 75 to the 100 kilowatt level. So I think the more appropriate type of exposure condition for this would definitely be over 50, probably more approaching 75. I think 35 is low. Also, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition to the modification. Rebuttal in support of the modification. Rebuttal in support.
Yeah, just commenting that this is, we commissioned with CLMA testing by UL under the guidance of Tom Fabian to compare the performance of E1354 tested products versus the underdeck flame test that California currently uses. This was the value that they recommended for using. I'm definitely not the expert that Tom Fabian and Dwayne Sloan at UL are.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and support. Re-rebuttal. Okay. At this point, we'll go back to testimony in support of the change as submitted. Further testimony in support. Testimony in opposition.
Marcelo Hirscher, GBH International, speaking for the American Fire Safety Council. There are a lot of problems. One problem has been slightly improved by the modification, but the modification doesn't work enough. But the proposal as submitted is unenforceable because, as we discussed, there's no heat flux, there's no orientation. The cone calorimeter, ASTM E1354, can be done horizontally or vertically. There's no thickness involved. Also, the gentleman who made the proposal said that this is an editorial change. It's nowhere close to an editorial change. What you're doing is saying that materials, and not just plastic lumber, all composites, can, instead of being tested to the extended ASTM E84 test, the 30-minute E84 can be tested to the ASTM E1354. It's the cone calorimeter. I'm very familiar. I sell that equipment. It's a small-scale test. It's a wonderful test, but not for this type of application. It's at the conditions proposed, it's much less severe. It doesn't give you the kind of information that you're looking for. Also, it was stated that this is in the substantiation, this is the same proposal as used by the state of California. It is not the same test that is used by the state of California. I urge disapproval. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, WUIC 4.
Kevin Reinertson with the California Office of the State Fire Marshal. Speaking with regards to the discussion and what's in the rationale as this being what's in the California standard. UWIC 4 brings in what we have in California, a standard for decks. This standard was promulgated in California with industry. It wasn't exactly as stated in the rationale as scientifically based. This was a compromise for us to get these types of materials into California for decking. Additionally, 80% of the homes that ignite in a fire, wildland fire, burn to the ground. This will have ignition and sustain. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition.
Sam Francis, American Forest and Paper Association. To elaborate on the problem with the California test, the California test is, as the proponent said, an under-deck test to measure flammability of the decking materials, whereas this section being modified is for ignition resistance to resist that initial ignition and exposure to wildland. Frank Beal at California Berkeley did most of the research that resulted in this California test, and frankly the California test is looking at an exposure under the deck and trying to measure its ability to transfer generally through the joints to the upper side. So it's a different circumstance altogether. Although this material is drawn and based upon the California test, these are very different circumstances, and we don't believe that it's appropriate to apply for the ignition resistance component of your wildland urban interface code.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, WUIC 4.
Joe Holland, Hoover Treated Wood Products. We have some additional concerns in that this only addresses the heat release from the material. What it doesn't talk about is whether you're going to have dripping, flaming material that can fall and ignite debris or stuff that might be underneath the deck. So it's incomplete. You need to have something in there to make sure that if the deck does catch on fire, that we're not going to have stuff dripping down, catching other things underneath the deck on fire, and we could lose the home in that respect too. Also, I believe ASTM is in the process of looking at what California has, and they do have an above deck standard that they're developing, and they do have an under deck standard that has either been developed or is close to that becoming a standard. And I would say that we need to wait and see till we do have an ASTM standard to cover this type of testing for all types of materials. We urge your disapproval.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. Rebuttal in support, WUIC 4.
John Weistman, the Composite Lumber Manufacturers Association. Just a couple things. The modification to allow testing to ASTM E1354 is limited to wood plastic composites that comply with ASTM D7032. It doesn't expand the testing opportunity to everything. It's limited to that product. That's what the text says. The reason that we're suggesting the ASTM E1354 test is because, as pointed out, the testing is an under-deck test, and we're testing wood plastic composite decking materials, not the joists to support the deck, just the decking materials. And the testing, that's the under-deck test, tests the whole assembly and has variables in there that we, as composite lumber manufacturers, don't address. We're just testing the composite decking materials. And the testing that we did at UL, a variety of composite decking materials, showed almost a 1-to-1 correlation of the peak heat release rate for the decking materials with the cone calorimetry test versus the under-deck flame test that California currently uses. Thank you.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and support. Re-rebuttal.
Marcel Hirscher, GBH International for the American Fire Safety Council. I want to repeat one more time. The test ASTM E1354 is not an underdeck test. It's not the test used in California. It's a small scale test with 4 inches of material and all the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Further rebuttal. That will close the floor testimony. WUIC 4. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion to disapprove.
Second. Hoover.
All right. You're still not on. Turn off your mic, Mike. Thank you.
We have a motion by Chief Hoover for disapproval. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Castelvecchi. Chief Hoover.
A couple items. First one is, I think what's being tried here is inconsistent with the definition for ignition-resistive materials. Also, I'd like to comment on the rationale that California used this. As was mentioned by one of the speakers, this was a compromise, not a scientific study.
Chief Crawford.
Yes, I'm in support of the motion for disapproval. I believe this proposal has some gross inadequacies and does not improve the requirements of the code. I request disapproval.
Concurring on the disapproval, also the lack of an appropriate radiant heat flux incident, and it's the wrong test.
Thank you, Mr. Castelvecchi. Ms. WUIC.
Thank you. I'm also in support of the disapproval of this code proposal. I just don't believe that the test proposed meets the intent of what we're trying to do with the material.
Okay, any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for disapproval of WUIC 4. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. All those opposed? The motion carries. Mr. Moderator, a motion for disapproval of WUIC 4 has carried.
Item WUIC 4 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item WUIC 5. I've been informed that there's unpublished errata on this.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to recuse myself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Do we have it? Okay. This on the screen now is the unpublished errata on WUIC 5. At this time, we'll take testimony in support. Sir.
Rocky Boyer with Roxel Installation, speaking for John Scott. This proposal is to introduce a new class of ignition-resistant building material into the IWUIC based upon testing in conformance with the newest edition of FM 4470 approval standard. The IWUIC generally has a very stringent expectations for Class 1 ignition resistance construction, and yet only requires a Class A roof covering. The scope of the IWUIC states in part, this code shall supplement the jurisdiction's building and fire codes. If such codes have been adopted to provide the special regulations to mitigate the fire and life safety hazards of the wildland urban interface areas. The ASTM E108 Class A test is for limiting flame travel and flame penetration of the roof coverings. It does not require ignition resistance of the roof coverings or roof insulation. The existing IBC and IFC requirements already permit Class A roof coverings, so that the existing Class 1 ignition resistance construction is no more stringent for wildland urban interface areas than for many other conventional buildings. To ensure low fire load insulation materials, additional requirements are needed to ensure lower combustibility for roof insulation materials. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in support. Item WUIC 5. Testimony in opposition. Just.
Jess Beidel, Hughes Associates, representing XPSA on this issue. This is identical to what we did in number 3. Again, for lack of any rationale, we're going to eliminate proven insulation materials that meet the requirements and fire test standards that we require of them now. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition.
Lorraine Ross, Syntec Consulting, representing PEMA and the Center for the Polyurethanes Industry. I'll stand on the same comments I made in opposition on WUIC 3, but also add to it that the charging paragraph for this particular code change proposal is 504.2, which reads, "The roof shall have a Class A roof assembly." When you look at definition for roof assembly, and that's going to take you into the IBC 1502, the roof assembly includes the roof deck, the vapor retarder, substrate or thermal barrier, insulation, vapor retarder, and roof covering. So once again, these systems are tested as complete systems, not as individual components. So for that reason, I'll ask for disapproval on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, WUIC 5. Rebuttal in support. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, WUIC 5 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Make a motion to disapproval.
Second.
Motion by Mr. McIlvaney for disapproval, seconded by Mr. Soltis.
Yes.
Mr. McIlvaney.
Again, back to what we talked about in number 4, this is a component item versus a system testing, and when we test these systems, it's a system of a testing of all components for Class A roofing materials, not just the insulation. So there may be other material that can be used and limited the materials that are available today.
Mr. Soltis.
Yeah, I concur, and also in reference to WUIC 3, we voted for disapproval on that. Tried to adopt a similar standard, and also 504.2. I think one of the opposition stated that we talk about Class A assemblies in 504.2 already.
Chief Crawford.
Yes, also in support of the motion for disapproval. When we recognize that one of the key things that was added into the code was the term assembly, we have to look at these things as a complete assembly and not just individual components.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for disapproval of WUIC 5. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. All those opposed? The motion carries. Mr. Moderator, a motion for disapproval of WUIC 5 has carried.
Thank you. Item WUIC 5 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item WUIC 6. Testimony in support, WUIC 6. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one at the mics, Mr. Chair, WUIC 6 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion to disapprove.
Motion by Mr. Wassam for disapproval. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Castelvecchi. Mr. Wassam.
Mr. Chairman, I think this concept is a good idea, but I just don't think it's quite ready for insertion in the code. There's some examples of passive language, and it really just reads like a first draft to me. A few examples, I wish there'd been a proponent here. I'd like to question why the occupancy list is short, leaves out some occupancies that I would consider as a hazard similar to those listed. So just don't think it's quite there yet.
Chief Crawford.
Yes, I have a bit of mixed feelings on this. I think the concept is a good one, and I'm more comfortable with it going into the appendix rather than in the body of the code. However, I'm sorry that the proponent is not here because I had some specific questions for him. One being, what triggers the initiation plan? What is it that determines that? Also, does this apply to all neighborhoods and occupancies, or is it only to existing, or is it new? So therefore, I don't think it's quite ready. It's a good attempt, but not quite ready. And I would venture that I would like to help the proponent to work on this so we can bring it back in the future if he so desires.
Thank you. Any? Chief Geislinger.
Yes, in addition, I think I'm in support of the concept, but this is not ready for insertion. The scope should be expanded to include facilities. We talk about campgrounds. Those really aren't identified by the occupancies or buildings. I think in 104.1, number 9, we should delete the second procedures of evacuation. We've got some duplication of that. And in I 106.1, it identifies the employees. In some cases, it may be appropriate, such as in a campground, to have the plan available to the occupants as well.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion for disapproval of WUIC 6. All those in favor of that motion signify. All those opposed to the motion, please raise your hand. The motion carries. Mr. Moderator, a motion for disapproval of WUIC 6 has carried.
Item WUIC 6 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, I've been asked to call again if there are any changes to the agenda in the fire code. We're turning right into the fire code at this point. Sir.
Mr. Moderator, Carl Wren, Austin Fire Department. There are interested parties that cannot be here for the emergency vehicle access discussion until tomorrow. So I would like to ask F-16 to be postponed to be heard with F-237. And if there's no objection from the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, to move F-17 to be heard with 237.
All right, let me see what you want to do here. You want to move F-16 to immediately follow?
No, to either follow or proceed F-237. Proceed, I would hope, but...
F-16 to the end of the agenda is what
yes,
you're telling me?
Yes, sir.
There's a motion to move item F-16 to the end of the agenda. Is there any objections from the House? Seeing none, item F-16 has been moved to the end of the agenda to follow item G-206.
No, F-237.
You want to follow F-237? You want to go before G-206, which is the end of the agenda?
Right, I want to be heard at the same time roughly as F-237.
F-16 has been moved to be heard with F-237.
15.
And if there's no objection from the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, I would like to ask for F-17 to be also moved to that point in the agenda.
So we've got F-216 and F-16 and F-17 to be moved to after F-237. Any objections from the House? Seeing none, so moved. Any other changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we're going to roll into the fire code. We call to the floor item F1. Testimony and support, item F1.
Mark Sampson, representing Joint Fire Service Review Committee. We'll stand on our reasoning statement, but we do provide, we would like to say that this would provide more flexibility to the code user.
Thank you. Further testimony and support, F1.
Morning, John.
Good morning, Dave. How are you?
Dave Collins, representing the American Institute of Architects. I think this is a very rational move. It will allow the code to be structured in an organization that allows everybody to understand it. I teach codes to a lot of architects, and finding them jumping around in the code trying to find things is not fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony and support, F1. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one at the mics, Mr. Chair, item F1 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion? Chief Crawford.
Yes, I move for approval as submitted.
Is there a second? Seconded by Ms. WUIC. Chief Crawford.
Yes, this is a logical reorganization of the code that will facilitate use now, and for the additional chapters that will be added in the future, it makes sense. It's time to do this. I support it.
Chief DeCrane.
I also support it, just to support what one of the speakers said while preparing for this hearing. It was very evident that the realignment would be of assistance.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and a second for approval of F1 as submitted. All those in favor, raise your hands. All those opposed? The motion carries 12-0. Mr. Moderator, a motion for F1 as submitted has carried.
Item F1 has been approved as submitted. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item ADM 34. ADM 34, testimony in support.
Good morning. I'm Lynn Kilpatrick with the Seattle Fire Department, representing the Washington State Association of Fire Marshals, speaking in support of Admin 34. The intent of this code change is to require a operational permit for LPG systems, which may have individual containers that do not exceed 500 gallons, but where the aggregate system quantity does exceed 500 gallons. And the second intent is to exempt barbecue containers of 5 gallons unless they are at a public assembly or on a public way.
Thank you. Further testimony and support.
Question.
Question for the proponent.
I've got, like what you're doing on some of this, I do have a concern with exception 2, and I'd like to bring that up if we modify it by eliminating exception 2. So I'd like to present that as a modification.
All right. Okay. So we're going to get the chair to rule on that. If you're going to treat that as a modification, we're going to get the chair to rule on that. Mr. Chair?
I'll rule it in order.
Okay, the modification's been ruled in order. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open the floor for testimony in support of the modification that's been recommended, which is to delete exception number 2. Is that correct, Robert?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to speak to that?
I'm in support of that. That's fine.
Thank you. We're speaking to the modification to delete exception number 2, only to the modification. Mr. Davidson?
Robert Davidson, Davis Code Council. Speaking for myself, I'm in support of that modification. There are just too many examples of where the propane may be used other than this public assembly. I can think of a mercantile use as having a special sale and suddenly they're setting up to provide some sort of hot food. I can think of the elementary school that has hot dog day and all of a sudden they're utilizing some barbecue grills. So I'm support the modification.
Thank you. Speaking only to the modification. Further testimony in support of the modification? Testimony in opposition to the modification? Seeing none, we're going to go back to the main motion for as submitted. Further testimony in support of as submitted? Testimony in opposition? Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item ADM 34 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Is there a motion?
Move to approve with the intent to modify.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Chief Crawford. Chief Geislinger.
Modification being to eliminate exception 2. And the reason for that, as it was mentioned from the floor, there are many times where the access to the public way, such as on my own driveway, is connected to serves a public way. So if I have a neighborhood party, I couldn't have a barbecue grill out there for that. So I think this eliminates that, and exception 1 does improve the code.
Chief Crawford.
Yes, just to concur with the motion for that. Let's not make it too restrictive. That's my second.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the modification? Hearing no further discussion, we will call the question on the modification, which is to delete exception 2 from Code Change Proposal ADM 34. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hands. All those opposed? The motion on the modification has been approved 12-0. We'll now go back.
Got to go back to the change.
Okay, we'll now go back to the main motion, which is now approval of ADM 34 as modified. Chief Geislinger.
Yes, I think this is an appropriate exception. It does allow, it does prevent a method that can be used to skirt the permit requirements.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we will call the question on approval of ADM 34 as modified. All those in favor, raise your hands. All those opposed? That motion passes 12-0. Mr. Moderator, ADM 34 has been approved as modified.
Item ADM 34 has been approved as modified. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item ADM 35, testimony and support. ADM 35.
Will Winslow, representing the city of Puyallup, and myself. As you can see, this particular proposal is intended to make sure that safety devices in the code are tested, or at least give the fire code official a tool to have that happen. Over the last couple of code cycles, we've done a lot of work on testing of safety devices, and in Chapter 27 now we have pretty comprehensive requirements for testing of gas systems and flow controls and that type of thing. But when I went through the code, I found lots of places, and as I pointed out, there's some 30-odd different references to safety devices. And some of those have testing requirements and others don't. So I think my experience is that if you don't test a safety device, it's probably worse than not having it, because you're operating under the assumption that this safety device is going to work when you need it. So what we're trying to do here is, in a simple fashion, pick up the locations in the code that have safety device requirements and make sure that if the fire code official wants, that those are tested on a regular schedule.
Thank you. For
Question.
We have a question for the speaker.
Is it your intent to renumber the existing 107.2.1?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. Joe?
Question. You used the word safety devices, but in your item you only say safety interlocks, emergency shutoff valves, and emergency shutoff switches. And those are the only ones will be able to require us to be tested. Are there other?
Right. No, there are not. This is the terminology that's used in the fire code. So it's inclusive.
So if I had these items, we're taking care of all those 30
yes.
places you talked about.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony and support. ADM 35. Testimony in opposition.
Jeff Shapiro. For purposes of disclosure, I do represent the Chlorine Institute and the International Institute of Ammonia Refrigeration, but I'm not speaking on their behalf on these issues, although they may be affected. I'm speaking on my own behalf. Generally speaking, I do agree with the concept of requiring controls to be tested, but there's a couple of problems with this as it's proposed. I didn't have a chance to talk with Mr. Winslow about it. But one problem is that it's not just the devices required by this code that are regulated, it's any device. And if you go through systems and manufacturing operations, there are micro switches and small devices all over those systems which may be safety related, but they're not safety controls required by this code. And to be able to test some of those internal switches and devices may be very difficult. So I think if this was to be considered, you would really want to limit it to only those devices required by this code rather than extending it beyond things that you're not even familiar with. The second concern I have with this is that it doesn't recognize the testing that might be required by process safety management. For facilities that are regulated under process safety management in accordance with the federal law, you're going to have testing requirements associated with your safety systems. There's no recognition of that here. It's just as required by the fire code official. And that always makes me a little bit nervous as to setting up a potential conflict between different regulatory agencies if you're already governed under federal law, and then you have the fire code official putting else something in addition. So for those two reasons, I think that it's a little premature to put this in. Conceptually, I don't have a problem with it, but I think it needs to be a little bit further developed.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. ADM 35. In opposition. Rebuttal and support.
Again, these are devices that are listed in the code is what the intent of this section is. And as I mentioned, some of these, when they were added to the code, had a testing element. Others, years past, were added, they don't have a testing element. So I'm not looking to reach out and be confusing. This is supposed to cover those devices which are already specified in the code, and that we get a testing requirement for those. So please don't be confused about any details. We're specifically working with the devices that are in the code currently.
Thank you.
Question.
Question?
You talk about testing. Is this the testing when it's first installed, or the annual testing or biannual testing or quarterly testing?
This is as required by the fire code official. So the testing frequency would be defined by the fire code official based upon the type of device and other factors. It's not given a time frame.
So what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, you would have a plant that's in my town and your town, and you can say every 3 years and I can say every month?
You could do that if that was your preference, yes.
Thank you. Further testimony, or excuse me, further rebuttal in support. ADM 35, rebuttal in support. Re-rebuttal. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item ADM 35 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Is there a motion?
Motion for approval as submitted.
Motion by Mr. Castelvecchi for approval as submitted. Is there a second? I don't hear a second. Is there a motion?
Motion for disapproval.
Motion by Mr. McElveny for disapproval, seconded by Mr. Geislinger. Mr. McElveny.
Yes, sir. Based on the testimony heard, the code official can have we could have inconsistencies throughout the jurisdictions, and also just not talk about the testing for is it new installation or maintenance testing, and each type of system is unique, and there may be components that don't require our testing, and it gets into a whole lot of minutia, I guess I would use the word.
I think it's fine.
Guys, if you're not going to speak, please turn off your mic. You keep cutting out the chair. As fun as that may be.
Chief Crawford.
I'm also in support of disapproval. I believe this is a moving target. It is going to be more of a confusion for the code official rather than an aid.
Mr. Castelvecchi.
I'm going to be in opposition to the motion because, and to answer the one question, the charging section of 107.2 talks about equipment requiring periodic testing or operation to ensure good maintenance. So that would say it would be periodic testing. I believe in answer to the opponent that where other standards require testing, that would be part of the negotiation process with the code official, and that there is things that needs testing that is not currently provided for in the code.
Chief Geislinger.
Yes. In the Chapter 21 example that's referenced in the written statement, that chapter references NFPA 86, which already specifies annual testing. This would provide guidance to the code official, creating a potential conflict that the code official could say, well, even though the standard says annual, I think it should be done every 3 months or every 6 months.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There is a motion and a second for disapproval of ADM 35. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hands. All those opposed? Motion for disapproval carries 11-1. Mr. Moderator, ADM 35 has been disapproved by the committee.
Item ADM 35 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action?
Yes, I'd like to move for assembly action.
What's your motion, sir?
It's to approve as submitted.
There's a motion on the floor to take an assembly action on item ADM 35. At this time, we're going to call the vote. Is there a second? Excuse me. Thank you. Keep me honest, Joe. Is there a second? There is a second. So there's a motion and a second to approve item ADM 35 as submitted. This action will require a 2/3 majority of voting members in the House. All those in favor of that motion, please raise your hand. And those opposed? That motion fails. Item ADM 35 has been disapproved. We call to the floor item F2, testimony in support, F2.
Mark Sampson, Joint Fire Service Review Committee. This was a previous definition that we put in the last code cycle. And we believe that we have changed the concept and the terms and vagueness that the committee had with it and the problems they had with it last time. The fire code hazard is defined 31 times in the fire code as it is now, with no reference to a definition. The committee said, why not use Webster's dictionary? It's not defined as a fire hazard, and with other points, we'll rest on that.
Question. You use a term customized, recognized as normally by personnel in public service regularly engaged in fire prevention. Explain that if you can. I'm sorry, it's an open-ended question.
Normal people in the fire prevention office, firefighters, emergency EMS personnel, whose duties are to diligently and enforceably.
Let me ask this question. Have you ever had an argument with one of your coworkers about a code section?
I'm assuming that's a rhetorical question, right?
Interpretation, yes.
Thank you.
Obviously, yes.
Further testimony in support. F2. Testimony in opposition.
Sam Francis, American Forest and Paper Association. My opposition to this particular code change proposal is more philosophic. The thing is, by this definition, only someone in the fire service actively engaged in fire prevention suppression can tell if a fire hazard exists. So you'll never get to prosecute another fire hazard case. Moreover, my 20 years in the public service don't mean squat today. I no longer know what a fire hazard is. So I can create them, and it seems to me you need to talk to your jurisdiction's attorneys. I think you're opening a huge enforcement nightmare on yourself by including that language. That's the problem that I see, that now it's confined to persons in the public service. What about the fire brigade? The industrial places, they won't know. In Phoenix, where they're making explosive charges for ejection seats, all of a sudden won't know that that's a fire hazard. Just because it can blow up the south half of town, they're not qualified. I think that's a big mistake to go down that kind of narrow definition. And frankly, I don't see what's wrong with using Webster. I may have been the one who said that in testimony before. I think I should have to know what a fire hazard is so I can avoid creating one.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. F2.
Larry Perry, Bowman International, speaking in opposition. I think there's still the same concerns from last year about whether you want to try to define this term or not. I'm not even going to really touch on that. If you're going to define it, you need to kind of keep it a wishy-washy, open-ended definition. So, whether that's worth putting in the code or not is up to you to decide. But I do rise specifically for that phrase, by persons in the public service regularly engaged in preventing, suppressing, or extinguishing fire. I think Sam touched on a lot of the reasons why you don't want to put that in the code. If you think you need that in the code, I would like to hear an explanation why you wouldn't need it for the second phrase of the definition. The second phrase says a fire hazard is also anything that obstructs, delays, hinders, or interferes with the operation of the fire department. Well, who makes that call? The first part, anything that's hazardous, it has to be these people with public service specialized in fire side of things. And then you leave it open-ended for the second part. If that's such a critical part of the definition, that would need to be there for both pieces of it. I would say that if you're going to define this, you don't need that language in there for either piece of it. If you're going to define a fire hazard, define what it is. Don't define who it is that's going to figure out and make the judgment. The book is enforced by somebody. That's who ends up making the call on everything in the book. So you don't need to try to pin down definitions to include specific criteria, especially a phrase that's not used anywhere else in the book as far as I'm aware of. So please shoot this down and let it get looked at, or just let it die.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. F2.
Mr. Moderator, Rick Thornberry with the Code Consortium. I'm representing the American Pyrotechnics Association, and we spoke in opposition to the change when it was proposed in the last cycle. And I went back and researched it because I thought this looked very similar. And the only changes I could see between the one that was disapproved last cycle and this cycle is the word a threat has been changed to menace. It was menace, and it's been changed to threat, I should say. And the term in the last part of this, the last line of the definition, safety of occupants, replaced egress of occupants. And that's the only change I see. And I don't think that helps to clarify this anymore. My big issue is the one that Mr. McIlvaney brought up, and that's going to be a very difficult thing to determine. And anything can be considered a fire hazard. And folks certainly that don't like consumer fireworks in the hands of consumers are going to call that a fire hazard. And then they're going to invoke code requirements, call it unsafe, etc. I think the term fire hazard has to be used within the context of its use in the code, and you can't define it because it is so varied. In 110.1.1, unsafe conditions, for example, it talks about which constitutes a fire hazard, and that shall be deemed an unsafe condition. So we can trigger an unsafe condition based on this definition, which to me is really outrageous. I mean, anything could be declared unsafe, as far as I can tell from this definition. To put it in context, Sam didn't bring it up, but in Chapter 19, lumber yards and woodworking, there's an issue where smoking constitutes a fire hazard. Then you're required to post no smoking signs. Well, that's certainly different than unsafe conditions where you have a fire hazard that creates that condition. Again, in Chapter 24, tents and membrane structures, in 2404.2.1 and 2404.2.2.
Thank you, Rick.
I'm sorry. Anyhow, you get the picture.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, F2.
Yes, good morning. My name is Sergio Barreto. I'm with Tokyo Marine Management. While I think that a definition of fire hazard is needed and might be a good thing for the future, I don't think this definition gets us there. One thing that I just quickly bring up is that you're defining fire hazard, yet the word hazard is used in the definition. I don't consider that's a good writing of a definition. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, F2. Rebuttal in support. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F2 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion for disapproval.
Castelvecchi for disapproval, seconded by Chief Love. Mr. Castelvecchi.
The language is still vague, and trying to say customarily by persons in preventing or extinguishing fire, that would say that my daughter that's just out the academy as a volunteer firefighter could determine a fire hazard, but a fire protection engineer working in a private company or working in the building inspections department as opposed to the fire marshal's office couldn't.
Chief Love.
Yeah, it's just, it appears to me to be too wordy. You have about 60 words in that particular definition. A quote from Wikipedia which talked about fire hazard, any situation that increases the likelihood that a fire may start, extend, or impede escape in the event of a fire occurs. So there are some other more succinct definitions out there available, so I think we just need to work on it more, maybe public comment modification.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, is a motion and second for disapproval of F2. All those in favor, please raise your hands. All those opposed to the motion? The motion carries 12-0. Mr. Moderator, F2 has been disapproved.
Item F2 has been disapproved by the committee. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item F3. We're taking testimony in support. F3.
Marcelo Herschel, GBH International, speaking for the American Fire Safety Council. This is basically just cleanup. If you go to section 808, there are already requirements for waste buckets in group I2 and I3 occupancies, not just I3, and it's not just in 808.1, it's in 808. So all this does is a little bit of cleanup. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in support. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F3 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Motion by Chief Hoover for approval as submitted, seconded by Mr. McIlvaney. Chief Hoover.
I would agree with the reasoning. It cleans up the code language. There's no reason to duplicate words.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for approval of F3 as submitted. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. All those opposed? Motion carries 13-0. Mr. Moderator, the committee has approved F3 as submitted.
Item F3 has been approved as submitted. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item F4. F4, testimony in support.
Mr. Moderator, I'm stepping down for F4.
Thank you, Robert. F4 to the floor. Dwayne.
Dwayne Garris, representing the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, in support of the modification, or support of F4. It clarifies the intent of the section and eliminates the vague language, subjective language, and the revision brings the section right out to deal with the hazard dealing with open burning.
Thank you. Question?
In this definition, there's a term called atmospheric conditions. What atmospheric conditions are bad when I shouldn't have open burning?
Well, an example in the state of Georgia, if you have heavy moisture, rain coming in, it keeps the smoke low in the area, and that's one that we always pose as a problem.
Thank you. Further testimony in support. F4.
Good morning, Howard Hardy, Fire Marshal Association of Colorado, representing the proponent on this code change. We will stand on a reasoning statement. However, would like to say that, specifically, even since we have just disapproved F2 that got rid of some of the vague terms, we feel it's critical to get rid of the vague terms in this code change. We have a lot of neighborhood disputes where they want us to be the smoke police. We would like to keep the code less subjective on this issue.
Thank you. Further testimony in support. F4.
Glenn Dean, Virginia State Fire Marshal's Office, in support and wondering why it's taken us so long to get this language right. Kind of a Me Too statement also, but to exemplify some of your atmospheric conditions could be high winds. Take a small fire and make it large due to the high winds, but also as it was alluded to just now, it may be something that is not related to fire so much. It could be, we've had cases in Virginia that approached a dispute within an apartment building because somebody was objecting to somebody's cigarette smoke or their burnt steak on the grill or something of that nature, and has nothing to do with a fire hazard. And in addition, this proposed language is in keeping with the code's scope and intent section.
Thank you. Further testimony in support. F4. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F4 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Motion for approval is submitted.
Second.
There's a motion by Chief DeCrane for approval as submitted, seconded by Mr. McIlvaney. Chief DeCrane.
As someone who responds to a number of these situations, it would be of great help to have some clarification. As one of the proponents was talking about, neighbors disputes happen quite often in the field, and we get a lot of complaints this way. It helps out clean it, or it helps us clean it up.
Is there any further discussion? Chief Crawford.
Yes, this makes the code more enforceable and removes the present subjectivity. I believe it's a good change.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for approval of F4 as submitted. All those in favor, please raise your hands. All those opposed? Motion carries 12-0. Mr. Moderator, F4 has been approved by the committee.
Item number F4 has been approved as submitted. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item F5. Testimony in support. F5.
Glenn Dean, representing the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, available for any questions. And based upon the previous action, this is going to work very well and very much in concert with that previous action.
Thank you. Further testimony in support.
Question.
F5. We have a question for the proponent.
In light of the action in the previous code change, is the exception needed?
I would say so.
Thank you. Further testimony in support, item F5.
Question.
Stay
Sorry.
there.
In the reason statement, you're talking about having the extinguishment be ordered, and my question is what happens when they don't do it?
It's a violation of the code.
And you give them a citation, and in 48 hours or something, they can...
Well, I mean, there are a number of options that are available. I mean, you can order the extinguishment either by the person that's responsible for the burning, or you can bring an engine company in and extinguish it yourself.
That's kind of my point. I think it takes away the fire code official's ability to have it extinguished by fire brigades.
I would disagree, but okay.
Thank you. Further testimony in support, F5. Testimony in opposition. In opposition? Sir.
Howard Hardy, Fire Marshal Association of Colorado. Actually, what we would request is that in 307.3 that the word objectionable be deleted. Would request that be a modification.
Okay. Let me get a ruling on that modification, and then we're going to speak to the modification. Mr. Chair, do you understand the proposed modification here?
Just so
you have it?
Just so I'm clear, they're deleting which words in 307.3?
The word objectionable.
That modification is in order.
Let me see if I understand the proposed modification. So what you're saying is 307.3 would read, when open burning creates or adds to a hazard or situation or a required permit for open burning has not been obtained, so on.
Correct.
No. Well, now I'm not clear. I thought you were going to remove the words "or objectionable."
And I think that's what we did. If I could read
Or
it.
objectionable? Or,
So it would
okay.
read, when
Or
open
objectionable.
burning creates
To a hazardous situation. Fine.
hazardous
Fine. To a hazardous situation.
Yes, sir. And that would be in line with
Okay. Oh, hold on. Don't speak to it yet. We got a ruling in order. At this time, we're going to take testimony in support of your proposed modification. You can speak to your modification. Okay, in support of the modification.
We feel that that modification would be in line with the recent approval of F4 to keep the two similar, where we also deleted the words objectionable or offensive. Other than that, we support the code change.
Thank you. Further testimony in support of the modification.
Glenn Dean, representing the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, we would agree with that modification.
Thank you. Further testimony in support of the modification. In opposition to the modification. Seeing no one at the mics, we're going back to opponent's testimony on as submitted. Rebuttal. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F5 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Committee, is there a motion?
Move to approve as submitted.
As submitted.
As submitted.
There's a motion for as submitted. Is there a second? Seconded by Chief Love. Mr. Merrill.
Yeah, I believe, I don't think we need the modification. I think leaving that with the word in there, I think makes more sense to leave objectionable.
Chief DeCrane.
I was going to speak against the motion because I think the modification makes a lot of sense, especially based on our past action. And if this is disapproved, I'll make a motion to approve as modified.
Are you making a motion to modify? You can do that now.
Yes, I'll make the motion to modify to remove the words "or objectionable."
Okay, motion by Chief DeCrane to modify. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Chief Crawford. Chief DeCrane, on the modification.
On the modification, I think it's absolutely in line with what we just, our actions on F4. We were removing the objectional out of F4, so I think it's consistent.
Any further discussion on the modification? Mr. Merrill.
Yeah, I still feel that that the objectionable should be in there, because I think I'd like to give the fire official if it's just an objectionable, gives them that latitude to add, to be able to act on something there.
Any further discussion on the modification? Hearing none, we will call. We need to call the question on the modification.
Call the modification.
We'll call the question on the modification. There is a motion and a second to modify F5 by removing the words "or objectionable" in 307.3. All those in favor of that motion, raise your hands. All those opposed? The motion on the modification carries 12-1. Now we call the question on the motion for approval of F5 as modified. All those in favor of that motion? Oh, I'm sorry.
We have discussion.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, is there any committee discussion on the motion for as modified? Chief Geislinger.
Yes, I'm going to vote against the motion for as modified. I think the correction without or objectionable was a good change. However, I do have concerns with the exception that was added in there. So the language we have right now says open burning shall be prohibited unless it's hazardous. The exception says, well, we can burn, we can do prescribed burning when it's hazardous. This has created, throughout the country, we've had catastrophic fires resulting from burns that were performed during times when they should not have been.
Go ahead.
Mr. Moderator, point of order. I think you cut off public debate because you went to a modification. It should come back to the floor for the
Absolutely
discussion on
not.
the
That
whole
modification was debated on the floor.
No, I'm talking about the motion as the item as a whole. I don't think went through the whole cycle.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. I came back and called. We discussed the motion. I came back and called for opponents.
All right, I'm sorry. I thought I missed that.
I got a little cheat sheet here, Rick. You're not going to mess me up. All right. No problem. Absolutely, no problem. We're back to discussion on the motion.
Any further discussion by the committee? Mr. Castelvecchi.
I'm going to be in opposition to the motion because where they say the fire code officials authorized to order the extinguishment of the open burning operation without specifying that the previous language that says he can call the fire department who order it to be done, and if they won't do it, call the engine company, needs to be retained in the code.
Chief DeCrane.
I think where he says he's authorized to order the extinguishment of the open burning operations, he can order the engine company to extinguish it. If we determine there's a hazard, I don't think there's anything prohibiting us from extinguishing a fire.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, we will call the question for approval as modified, F5. All those in favor of that motion, raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All those opposed? The motion carries 10-3. Mr. Moderator, F5 has been approved as modified by the committee.
Item F5 has been approved as modified. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none.
Mr. Moderator, sure. Before we move to F6, I will be recusing myself on F6.
Thank you. We call to the floor item F6. Testimony in support, F6.
Glenn Dean with the Joint Fire Service Review Committee, standing on a supporting statement, and to head off a question, this change would allow for permitting of various commodities that individually those commodities may not reach their permit threshold, but as an aggregate, once they hit the 2,500 cubic feet, then you can require a permit. Otherwise available for
Thank you. Further testimony in support, F6. Testimony in opposition. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F6 is yours.
Committee, I need a motion.
I make a motion to support F6.
Second.
Chief Hoover.
It generalizes the storage requirements, cleans it up.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, committee need a motion. See a show of hands for those in favor of the motion. Any opposed? Motion carries 11-0. Mr. Moderator, F6 has passed. As submitted.
Item F6 has been approved as submitted. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none. At this time, we'll take testimony in support of item F7. F7, testimony in support.
Glenn Dean, representing the Joint Fire Service Review Committee. We are speaking to the errata that was published on F7.
Yes, sir.
Okay, stand on the supporting statement.
Thank you very much. Further testimony in support of item F7. Mr. Nichols.
Mr. Terry, good morning. Dan Nichols, New York State Department of State. We've had this requirement in the State Fire Prevention and Building Code in New York for some 30 years. We developed it to protect, especially in urban areas, signage, now second generation use of roofs with cellular telephone towers, cabling, tripping hazards. We feel that this is time to bring it over to the international code. It's provided a great benefit for firefighter safety in New York. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony?
Question
of the speaker or of the proponent?
You or the chair. Errata, I don't see the errata in the book. I'm missing it. F7, they said.
There's published errata. Staff, help me out.
I don't have any errata either.
You have errata, staff? Mr. Dean. The errata is?
The errata is, the section would start off simply saying wires, cables, ropes, aerial antennas. It does not have the verbiage installing or maintaining at the beginning of that section.
Do you have that, Mr. Mueller? Do you have that, Mr. Chair?
I got it off the ICC site.
Is that errata? Do we have that as errata? Okay. Staff doesn't have that as an errata. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at that as a modification. Are you proposing that as a modification, Mr. Dean?
I'll do so.
Okay, we're going to propose that as a modification. Let's get a ruling on the modification.
What's the modification first?
We're going to state it again. We're going to state it again.
The modification would be deleting the words from the proposed change, deleting the words installing or maintaining, the first three words. The section would begin by saying wires, cables, ropes, aerial antennas, and so on.
You got it, Mr. Chair?
Yes, that modification is in order.
That modification is in order. Okay. So we're going to take testimony in support of the modification, which I think we've already heard, and in opposition to the modification. Relax. In support. Okay. We're talking to the modification only at this point, in support of the modification. If you're going to change the modification again, you're going to make me angry.
Now, just further explanation.
Thank you.
The verbiage installing or maintaining is not needed because it would be redundant to the language further in a statement.
Fantastic. Thank you. Further testimony in support of the modification. Testimony in opposition to the modification. Now we're going to go back to the change as submitted, and we are on testimony in support of the change as submitted.
Good morning, Bill McHugh, Chicago Roofing Contractors Association. Firefighters aren't the only people that are on roofs at night or in the dark. Our workers are on roofs maintaining those systems sometimes at night as well. Although safety is a big part of education for most of the major roofing organizations that train the workers. Nighttime safety is very difficult when you can't see very well. So we support this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next time you testify, move a little closer to the mic for me, okay?
Question for the proponent.
Further, you have a question?
Yeah, question for the proponent.
For the proponent, okay. We're in testimony and support, and we've got a question for the proponent.
What's the reason for it being limited to wires, ropes, and cables as opposed to other rigid obstructions such as beams, solar panels, decks, and whatnot?
Typically, you don't get clotheslined by those items.
Thank you.
They're readily seen.
Thank you. We are in testimony in support.
Marcel Herschel, GBH International, speaking for myself. In view of the testimony from the previous gentleman, I propose a modification to the exception to change the word firefighters to persons.
You're going to go with another modification here, aren't you? Okay, let me get a ruling. Mr. Chair, firefighter to person.
Modification's in order.
The modification is in order. So now we're going to talk to that modification.
Well, very simple. Firefighters aren't the only people who can work on the roof, so I think that
firefighters are people too. There you go. Further testimony in support of the modification that we're discussing? In opposition? Seeing none, we're going to go back to the motion for as submitted further testimony in support. Now we're in testimony in opposition. Mr. Collins.
Dave Collins, American Institute of Architects. I'm not really in opposition to the code change. I think the concept is very valid, and actually even in the supporting statement they talk about some methodologies for establishing a barrier of some sort that would allow you to be able to see these devices more readily. But I think the list is wrong. I think we should talk about all kinds of things. I've walked into the side of an air conditioning unit that was up on stilts. And I think we need to talk about what kind of barriers we're going to provide, and actually the barrier they talk about could actually become a tripping hazard if you just put a pipe down there. So it's a question of how are we going to do this, how do we intend to achieve it, and I just don't think this code change is complete. Thank you.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, F7.
Larry Perry, Bowman International, also speaking in opposition. Yeah, that's my concern too, is we're putting this basically a prohibition that says there can't be anything within 7 feet of the roof. That's what it says. So anything that's up on the roof has to float 7 feet above the roof. I don't think that's what they mean. I heard talk about concern about getting clotheslined, but that's not really what the wording says. It says anything that's within 7 feet of the roof. Can't have it unless you somehow do something to protect firefighters or persons working on the roof. That's not good language, but that means anything that's going to go on the roof now, you're going to get triggered and go to this exception and try to figure out if what's there is safe, or if somebody needs to do something to whatever's up there on the roof to make it safe for somebody that's working up there. Now you're flagging what may be an important issue, but you're not providing a whole lot of guidance for how to address what the problem is. That's worse than not having anything in the code at all on it. I recommend you disapprove this, and maybe it can get worked on in the future to come up with some better language as to what type of protection would be adequate for what type of elements.
Question.
Question for the speaker.
Since this is in the fire code official will have to review the plans, I'm assuming, for the roof construction material when it's added onto it in order to catch this, since this is not in the building code. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition, item F7. Rebuttal and support. Mr. Dean.
Glenn Dean, Joint Fire Service Review Committee. I think the intent has been addressed and is clear enough. If there's some additional guidance or explanatory material needed, I think, like in other sections of the code, the commentary will adequately cover it.
Thank you. Further rebuttal and support. Re-rebuttal. Seeing no one wishing to be heard, Mr. Chair, item F7 is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Is there a motion, committee?
Make a motion for disapproval.
Motion by Mr. McIlvaney for disapproval. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Soltis. Mr.
This-
McElvaney.
Yeah, this item is currently going to be installed in fire code. The fire code official will not see the installations of these wires, cables, ropes, area antennas, because that's all done by the building official and usually in the building code. If this section should go further, it probably needs to be in the building code. And also, as talked about, how do you protect these items? And there was discussion about ductwork, fans, and motors and other items. So I think the concept's right, but I think it belongs in the building code, and there's some other additional corrections that need to take place.
Chief Geislinger.
Yes, in addition, I'm concerned about the language in the exception in a manner to prevent injury to persons or firefighters, whichever were to come back. I see this as an Attorney Full Employment Act. The reality is we should have this as an approved as approved by the fire chief. As the language is right now, if someone gets injured up there, de facto the installation was not installed correctly.
Any further discussion, committee? Hearing none, we'll call the question. There's a motion and second for disapproval of F7. All those in favor of that motion, raise your hand. All those opposed, raise your hand. Motion carries 13-0. Mr. Moderator, F7 has been disapproved by the committee.
Item F7 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action? Seeing none, we call to the floor item RB9 Part 2. RB9 Part 2.
Sean DeCrane from the Cleveland Fire Department, representing the Cleveland Fire Department and the International Association of Firefighters. Let the record show, as a committee member, I've recused myself from this action.
Thank you.
And I'm speaking to the committee and asking them for disapproval. Actually, so there are some modifications we
We're
need to make to this
testimony and
proposal.
support on RB9.
That's true. Okay.
Anybody in support? Okay, now you can talk.
Okay. Do I have to restate my name?
No.
Actually, I'm asking for disapproval so we can work on this and bring it back in public comment.
Thank you. Further testimony in opposition. Rebuttal in support. Seeing no one wishing to be heard. Mr. Chair, RB9 Part 2 is yours.
Committee, is there a motion?
Motion to deny.
Motion for disapproval by Mr. Soltis. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Castlevecchi. Mr. Soltis.
Yes, I agree with Chief DeCrane. It was an interesting concept, but it needs a lot of work. There's quite a bit of information here to go forward with.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, I'm going to call the question. There's a motion and a second for disapproval of RB9. All those in favor of the motion, raise your hands. All those opposed, the motion carries 12-0. Mr. Moderator, RB9 has been disapproved by the committee, and I will also be stepping down on F8 and F30, which are the next two code changes.
Well, I'm glad you said that because you're going to get to say it again, but let me take care of business first. Item RB9 Part 2 has been disapproved. Is there a motion for assembly action?
I'm sorry.
Seeing none, at this time, we will take a 10-minute break.
Fire Code Committee, please stay up here quick in the corner when we break.